What if the things that Donald Trump believes about Mexico aren't just political slogans, but they're actual myths? Today I'm going to look at the receipts, and I'm going to debunk the 10 biggest lies that the current US president has said about Mexico. Number one is Mexico will pay for the wall. Imagine a contractor promises to fix your roof and swears your neighbor will pay for the bill. But when the work's done, the invoice lands in your mailbox and you're stuck paying it. That's exactly what happened to the wall. Donald Trump repeatedly promised that Mexico will pay for the border wall. And what he framed it as is he said it was a guaranteed deal, like he always does. But Mexico never agreed to pay for it. Not in the first place, not ever. Not publicly, not privately, not ever. And Mexican leaders said no right from the beginning. And even 8 years later, there hasn't even been a single penny that's been paid for the wall by Mexico. And you know who paid for that wall? US taxpayers. And that was included money that was shifted from military funds. Over 10 billion was moved from the military budget to pay for the border wall construction between 2019 and 2020. But much of this so-called new wall was just replacing old fencing. And large sections were never completed. There wasn't much added to the existing wall. And when it became clear that Mexico wouldn't pay for it, the explanation changed from Trump to these vague claims about tariffs and trade pressure. Donald Trump claimed that Mexico would pay for the border wall indirectly through the savings and increased tax revenue generated from the USMCA. This is a trade deal that's between Canada, US, and Mexico. He actually argued that it would bring so much money back to the US economy that the wall would essentially pay for itself. But that never worked. The only ones who seem to benefit from these trade deals are the companies who made the products. The government never profits from these things. So within this whole thing, Mexico never ended up paying because they weren't going to in the first place. The original promise by Donald Trump was never fulfilled. But this claim, it worked. It worked really well politically because it sounded tough and simple, even though it wasn't true. And it made him look super tough with his voters. Saying that they would pay for it made him sound like a strong, confident leader. And people like when things are simple, even if it's this complicated immigration thing. Other politicians talked about the border wall in Mexico before Donald Trump. They used boring, detailed policy language. Not these big promises that Trump promises. None of them said that Mexico would ever pay for the US wall. But Trump didn't invent this issue. He changed how it was talked about. He used short, simple, and confident sentences instead of complex explanations. And the promise sounded like an easy win for the USA. And because it sounded so simple, people stopped asking how it would work. In cases like this, and many other things Trump says, framing the issue matters more than the facts do. It's master manipulation by a master manipulator. Number two, he said that they're sending their worst. Donald Trump told you to be scared of bad hombres storming the gates. But if you look at the actual police data, the most dangerous thing about an average Mexican immigrant is how hard they work. Donald Trump claimed that Mexico was sending criminals and their worst across the border from Mexico, making it sound like an attack on the US from Mexico. There is no proof that Mexico sends people illegally over the border. People move on their own, usually because of economic hardship or danger back in their home country. Most immigrants are not criminals. They're families, workers, and some are even asylum seekers from other countries. Multiple studies show that immigrants commit less violent crime than US-born citizens, including undocumented citizens. The claim that they're more dangerous uses fear-based language, which makes it emotionally powerful, especially when you don't have evidence. And it's used to make US citizens feel like they're in danger and something needs to be done. Calling immigrants the worst dehumanizes people and makes complex immigration issues sound simple and threatening. Calling foreigners criminals creates an enemy, which makes policies that governments want to pass easier to support. They make you believe their lies by feeding it to you in simple ways just to get what they want. It could be your vote, it could be more money, or it could be more power. There's no data showing this crime wave caused by Mexican immigrants. But ICE is out in the streets now manufacturing this crime wave. Their presence in the streets of many US cities right now is making it look chaotic. And when people think that there's chaos and problems, they can be easily controlled by fear. Fear is one of the best tools to use to get what you want, especially when you're a politician. Fear spreads faster than facts because it makes people feel more, not because it's actually true. Number 3, Mexico is eating our lunch on trade. Trump says that the US is losing billions of dollars every year to Mexico. But that's like saying you lost money to Amazon because you bought a TV. You didn't lose money. You got a TV. That isn't theft. It's buying things. One of Donald Trump's best lies claimed Mexico was winning at trade and taking advantage of the USA, saying it like US is losing because of Mexico. The trade between US and Mexico is deeply shared, connected, and super complicated. He makes it sound like it's a winner-take-all scenario. And that couldn't be further from the truth. Many products are built from both sides of the border. And a lot of manufacturing is a team effort from US workers and Mexican workers. Take cars, for example. They're co-built, with parts crossing the border sometimes multiple times. A car part might start in the US, like an engine block or a computer chip. Then it gets shipped to Mexico, where workers add parts, wires, and other things. After that, that same part might go back to the USA to have more pieces added. This can happen multiple times before the car is even finally finished. And millions of other US jobs highly depend on trade with Mexico, including farming, manufacturing, and transport. Also, let's not forget that Mexico is one of the largest buyers of things made in the USA, which obviously supports lots of US workers and the economy. People like Trump like to simplify the job market, but there's a lot of factors that cause job losses, like automation, technology, and corporate greed. It's not because of Mexico. Saying that Mexico is stealing from America is taking a complex situation and simplifying it again. Donald Trump loves to do this. Can you see the pattern? What he's doing with this is ignoring how much both economies are interconnected. It actually gives people someone to blame for job losses and factory closures in the USA. And once there's a villain, Trump can say that he's the only one tough enough to fix this problem. That makes people feel safe for choosing and voting for him. People who believe this story feel like they finally understand of what's going on, and they actually have someone who can change it. That feeling he gives his followers is powerful. It makes them stick with him even when details don't add up. Number 4, the Mexican government does nothing to stop migration. You often hear that Mexico rolls out a red carpet for immigrants to walk straight into Texas. Trump loves to claim that the Mexican government isn't doing anything whatsoever at the US-Mexico border. But it's actually the opposite. Mexico actively enforces migration controls, including checkpoints, detentions, and deportations. Mexico detains and deports hundreds of thousands of migrants every single year, especially ones that enter from South America. And a lot of times these actions happen deep inside Mexico, not just near the US border. When Mexico cracks down on migrants, it means stopping people, detaining them, and sometimes sending them back to their own country. A lot of those migrants are poor families or people escaping poverty and violence back home. Many Mexicans see this, and they feel bad for them. So when the government's tough on migrants, it can look cruel, even if it's legal. And a lot of times it hurts the Mexican government's popularity. There's also a second problem: money and resources. Enforcing these rules costs a lot. Police, soldiers, buses, detention centers, paperwork, all of that costs taxpayers money. And many people in Mexico would rather see that money spent on schools, hospitals, or fighting local crime. So they get upset when resources are used to enforce another country's border. Then there's pride and sovereignty. Some Mexicans feel like the crackdowns happen because the US pressures Mexico to do it. That makes the government look weak, like it's taking orders from outside. And nobody likes feeling pushed around, especially by a richer and more spoiled neighbor. Mexico can slow down migration, but it can't fully control it, unlike the way that Donald Trump says. So what does he get from this? First, he gets someone else to blame. If migration looks chaotic, he can point at Mexico and say they're not doing their job. That actually keeps people from looking too closely at US laws, asylum rules, or court backlogs. Second, he gets pressure power. By saying Mexico does nothing, he creates this public anger, and that anger becomes a tool. He can then threaten terrorists, border shutdowns, or insults to enforce Mexico to crack down harder on what's actually happening. Like loud complaints turn into bargaining chips. That's what happens. Third, he looks tough without actually fixing the system. Fixing migration is slow and boring. Saying Mexico is lazy makes him look strong and decisive right now, even if nothing actually changes. Fourth, he simplifies a hard problem. Migration has a lot of causes: violence, poverty, climate, US demand for labor. Blaming Mexico turns all that into a simple sentence, turns it into simple stories that travel further than true stories. And fifth, he avoids responsibility. If Mexico is doing nothing, then any failure isn't his fault. The blame stays outside the US, where voters can't punish him for it. So what does he really gain? He gains a villain. And a villain is basically a bargaining tool and a political scapegoat. Number 5, tariffs on Mexican goods are a tax on Mexico. Trump talks about tariffs like punishment for other countries. He says I'll tax Mexico 25%. But if you look at the receipt of your car or groceries, you'll see that the only person getting punished is you. Trump basically said that tariffs on Mexican goods would make Mexico pay, like it was a punishment to Mexico. He made it sound like the US would win because of it. Here's what he didn't say. A tariff is a fee paid by US companies when goods enter the country. The Mexican government doesn't pay the tariff. The Mexican people don't pay the tariff either. What happens is that the US companies raise prices to cover extra costs. So yeah, those costs are for the US consumer. Higher prices mean Americans end up paying more for everyday items. When tariffs were placed on goods, the costs moved to the US shopper. Calling tariffs a tax on Mexico misuses the word tax. The tough sounding line just sounds better for his followers than explaining it properly. So the pressure from tariffs mostly landed on Americans, not Mexicans. And he gets to sound tough without sounding complicated. It's a win-win for him. Tariffs are confusing. Most people don't know who's actually paying them. By saying Mexico will pay, he makes it sound like a punishment that hurts someone else, not Americans. That makes him look strong and clever at the same time. Second, he creates the feeling of control. Tariffs sound like a button that he can press whenever he wants, but it doesn't work that way. He just has this idea that he can just say, I'll charge them. It makes him look strong and like he's in charge, even if the real situation isn't quite that way. And the third reason Trump says this is he reinforces the same enemy story. It keeps Mexico in a role of a cheater who needs to be punished. Once people believe that, they're more likely to support his aggressive moves without asking any questions. Number 6, bombing the cartels will fix the drug problem. Trump has suggested that shooting missiles into Mexico will destroy the drug cartels. It sounds like a Hollywood action movie, but in the real world, you can't bomb an addiction problem. And trying to will definitely start a war with Mexico. Donald Trump has suggested many times that bombing drug cartels is a fast way to fix the problem. He says it even more now since they went into Venezuela. This idea sounds simple, like an action movie solution, which is why some people in the USA actually like this idea. They love their action movies. But the thing is that the drug cartel doesn't exist only in one place. They're spread through cities, towns, and neighborhoods. And bombing cartels would for sure hurt civilians and destroy homes and communities altogether. Mexico is a separate country, and bombing it without permission would be a major violation. And that kind of attack would seriously damage the relationship between the US and Mexico and could escalate into conflict that nobody wants. And even if the cartel leaders were killed, the drug trade wouldn't stop. I don't know what some people think. It's just going to end. When one cartel member falls, another usually replaces it. And the drug problem continues because the demand comes largely from inside the USA. That demand is what fuels the whole industry. And if there's the demand, there will be the supply no matter what. No bombing or violence will fix this. And that same demand will make sure that once one leader is removed, there will be another one to replace him. Donald Trump says this because it makes him sound like a strong leader. And for some of the US population, bombing sounds like a fix. That makes people feel like the problem could be taken care of right away. It also turns a complicated problem to a simple one with only one enemy. Drugs are complicated. They involve addiction, demand inside the USA, money, and crime. This idea of bombing cartels turns all of this into one bad guy that you can quickly attack and bomb and get rid of. But simpler stories are easier to sell. And that's what Donald Trump's doing here. It also shifts blame away from the USA. If cartels are the problem, then Americans don't have to look at the drug demand, healthcare problems, or addiction issues. And this problem just lives somewhere else in a different country. So what does he get from this? He gets attention, a tough image, and an easy story. Even though bombing wouldn't solve the drug problem and would most likely make a lot of things a lot more worse. But if you ask me, I don't want to find out what will happen if he actually does. Number 7, the border is wide open. If you watch certain news channels in the US, you'd think that the border was this broken gate swinging in the wind. But if you actually tried to cross it, you'll find yourself facing the most militarized, surveilled, and fortified line in the Western Hemisphere. Donald Trump has repeatedly said that the border was wide open. These words create an image of chaos with no rules or enforcement for the US people when they hear this. But the US border has never been literally open. There are border patrol agents, barriers, checkpoints, surveillance, and laws in these places. Border security is a big business in the US. People are stopped, detained, processed, and deported every single day. The US taxpayer spends hundreds of billions of dollars each year on the US-Mexico border. Increased migration does overwhelm the system sometimes. But overwhelmed is not the same as wide open. Crowded scenes at the border on the news were mistaken for lack of enforcement in the past. And honestly, border crossing rates, they rise and fall due to outside forces like violence, jobs, and the weather. Saying that it's wide open makes it sound like everyone that comes in ignores asylum laws and legal processes. Makes everybody look like criminals. These words work though because images painted with fear spread faster than proper explanations. The reason he says these things is first, it sounds like an emergency. If people feel like something is out of control right now, they're more likely to support extreme solutions without asking any questions whatsoever. And we all know this guy can be extreme. Second, it makes himself look necessary. If everything feels out of control, people want a stronger leader. Saying that the border is wide open makes him look like the only one willing to act on it. Third, he avoids hard explanations. The real border situation is complicated and boring. Calling it wide open skips everything and replaces it with one scary picture. But what does Donald Trump get from this? He gets attention, support, and permission. Attention from fear, support from people who want order and vote for him, and permission to push tough policies without actually having to explain any of the details. Number 8, Mexico is just a dangerous shithole. Trump once famously called Haiti and African nations shithole countries. While he didn't use that exact word for Mexico, he did tweet that Mexico was the #1 most dangerous country in the world. He wants you to believe that the neighbor to the south is a war zone, not a G20 economy. He's also repeatedly described Mexico using degrading, insulting language, saying that it was dangerous and worthless. The language treated Mexico and Mexicans as one single bad place, ignoring the size and diversity of the actual country. Mexico is a large, complex country with cities and towns and schools and businesses and families living completely normal lives. Crime exists in some areas, but it's not chaos everywhere. It's just like the US or any other country. Millions of Americans have traveled to, lived in, retired in, and do business in Mexico every single year. If Mexico was just a complete war zone, or like a lot of people who say in my comments, a failed state, and if this was all true, that level of investment in travel wouldn't happen here. Here's something you might not know. Name calling doesn't explain crime or fix problems. And this wasn't some brilliant policy based in strategy that he just came up with. It's just an insult that is basically a shortcut. Language like this shrinks a complex country and people into unfair stereotypes. And what Donald Trump does is he simply does it to dehumanize Mexican people. And they don't deserve this one bit. When you describe a whole country as dirty or dangerous, it stops you from seeing the people who actually live there like normal human beings. And that makes it easier to pass sneaky, harsh policies that otherwise no one would accept. Number 9, Chinese companies are using Mexico as a backdoor. There's a rumor spreading that China is setting up shop in Mexico to sneak cars into the USA tax-free. It sounds like a clever Hollywood heist movie. But the boring reality is that trade laws make this so-called backdoor nearly impossible to open. Donald Trump claimed that Chinese companies are using Mexico as a backdoor into the USA. The word backdoor implies a secret or illegal scheme. Companies from China invest into Mexico as part of normal global business. And that's because Mexico attracts factories, because of skilled workers and the proximity to the USA, not because of loopholes. Trade rules say for a product to enter the USA without extra taxes, a big part of it has to be made in North America. And Mexico is part of North America. And because of that, some Chinese companies choose to build factories in Mexico. They're not sneaking around. They're following strict rules that require production to happen in Mexico or in North America. If the product isn't actually made in North America, it doesn't qualify and it gets taxed. And these products can't just be relabeled as made in Mexico without meeting strict rules. Custom inspections, audits, and enforcement exist to catch a lot of these violations. These foreign factories in Mexico often buy US parts and sell goods back to the US. And a lot of times they support American jobs. Of course, some rule breaking does happen, but it's not this massive scheme that Trump says it is. He says it because it sounds sneaky and threatening. Backdoor makes people think rules are being broken, even when they aren't. The word backdoor instantly creates suspicion. It connects fear into one story. Some people in the US worry about China, and some people in the US worry about Mexico. But putting them together makes the biggest enemy ever. These words make normal businesses sound like they're cheating. Global companies building factories in Mexico is legal and common. Calling it a backdoor, that turns it into a trick, even when these companies are following all the rules. This makes Donald Trump look like he's the only one paying attention. By saying everyone else missed this, he looks smart to some people. Like he's exposed the hidden truth that nobody saw but him. It gives him an excuse to push harder into trade rules. And if people believe there's a secret scheme, they'll support tougher tariffs and restrictions without asking any questions. So what does he get from saying this? He gets fear, suspicion, and support for tougher policies. Even though the situation is mostly legal, regulated, and not secret whatsoever. Number 10, Americans don't benefit from the relationship with Mexico. The biggest lie of all is that cutting ties with Mexico would make America great again. The truth, if they closed the border tomorrow, US grocery shelves would go empty in 3 days, and the auto industry would crash in a week. Donald Trump claimed that Americans don't benefit from the relationship with Mexico. It's all framed as a one-sided relationship and completely useless for the USA. But the truth is completely different from this. Millions of Americans benefit daily from trade with Mexico. US farmers sell massive amounts of food to Mexico. American factory workers, truck drivers, and small businesses depend on cross-border trade every single day. The US-Mexico partnership is one of the largest trade relationships the US has. Trade with Mexico helps prices in the US stay lower for groceries, cars, and household goods. Cutting this relationship will raise the cost for Americans almost instantly. The two countries, they cooperate on security, law enforcement, and disaster response, to name a few things. This relationship isn't a loss for the USA. It's a shared system that the US and Mexico actually rely on. But saying this puts Trump in this hero role again. If everyone else accepted a bad deal, he gets to say that he's the only one brave enough to break it and make things better. Once again, it stops people from asking deeper questions. If their relationship is framed as worthless, no one asks how it actually works or who relies or depends on the whole system altogether. So what does he get from saying this? He gets permission. Permission to attack, disrupt, or threaten a relationship with Mexico when he wants to and how he wants to. Because in that case, people believe, and they start to believe, that they have nothing to lose, that there's nothing to lose. And as we see what he's been saying lately, those words might run into dangerous actions that benefit nobody but Donald Trump himself and his rich elite buddies. Now, I'm sure if you came this far in this video, you liked it. And I have good news, because I have other videos that you would like this one right here. This is Mexico next, after the US invades Venezuela? Click it and I'll see you there. Thanks for watching.